Welcome to Buried Truths, where the dust of time is swept away and history's deepest secrets rise to the surface. In the early 20th century, Japan emerged as a rising imperial power in Asia, having defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. This victory marked the first time an Asian nation had defeated a European power in modern warfare, boosting Japan's confidence and ambition. During World War I, Japan expanded its influence by seizing German-held territories in the Pacific and parts of China. After the war, Japan became one of the victorious Allied powers and gained further prestige. However, dissatisfaction grew when the Treaty of Versailles did not fully meet Japan's territorial expectations. In the 1930s, Japan's aggressive expansion resumed, starting with the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. The League of Nations condemned this act but took no substantial action, encouraging Japan to push further. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale war against China, known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, leading to widespread atrocities like the Nanking Massacre. The United States viewed Japan's actions with increasing alarm. American interests in Asia, particularly in the Philippines and China, were threatened. The U.S. condemned Japan's invasion of China, but refrained from direct military involvement. Instead, it provided limited aid to China and began to reconsider its economic ties with Japan. Japan, facing limited natural resources, became increasingly reliant on imports of oil, steel, and rubber. Much of this came from the United States. But Japan's continued aggression in Asia forced President Franklin D. Roosevelt to take firmer steps. In July 1941, after Japan occupied French Indochina, the U.S. froze Japanese assets and imposed an oil embargo. These sanctions threatened the survival of Japan's war effort. Japan saw the embargo as an existential threat. Without oil, Japan's Navy and Air Force would grind to a halt. In response, Japan's military leadership began to consider options, including diplomacy and war. Talks with the United States began, but stalled quickly due to mutual distrust and opposing demands. While Japan pretended to negotiate, it secretly began planning for war. The Imperial Japanese Navy, under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, developed a bold plan to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a surprise attack. The goal was to buy Japan time to seize resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia before the U.S. could respond. By late 1941, Japan had finalized its plans for an attack on Pearl Harbor, the primary base of the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. The attack was scheduled for early December. Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts continued as a cover for the military buildup. American officials, though suspicious, did not anticipate an attack on Hawaii. On December 6, 1941, President Roosevelt made a final appeal for peace. At the same time, Japanese aircraft carriers were already sailing toward Hawaii, preparing to launch the most infamous surprise attack in American history. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the world forever. The idea of attacking Pearl Harbor originated within Japan's high command as a means to neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet before Japan launched its southern expansion. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, though personally opposed to war with the U.S., believed that a surprise, decisive strike was the only way Japan could succeed in a prolonged conflict. Yamamoto studied the layout and operations of Pearl Harbor in depth. He understood the risks, but he also knew that if the American fleet remained intact, it could challenge Japan's expansion into Southeast Asia. He proposed a sudden aerial attack to cripple American naval power in one blow. The plan, known as Operation Z, was bold and unprecedented. It relied entirely on surprise and required meticulous coordination. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, the largest strike force ever assembled, would secretly sail across the Pacific under radio silence. Over 400 aircraft were prepared for the assault, including torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. Japanese military intelligence worked intensely to gather details about Pearl Harbor's defenses. Spies in Hawaii sent coded reports back. To Tokyo, providing maps, photographs, and ship positions. The Imperial Navy even developed modified torpedoes that could operate in the shallow waters of the harbor. While Yamamoto and his planners refined the details, a team of Japanese pilots began training rigorously. They practiced bombing techniques on mock-ups of American battleships and rehearsed the timing and sequence of attacks. Morale was high as the pilots believed they were part of a heroic mission that could save their nation. The task force, led by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, departed from Hitokapu Bay in northern Japan on November 26, 1941. The ships maintained strict radio silence and sailed in a wide arc across the northern Pacific to avoid detection. Meanwhile, Japan continued diplomatic negotiations with the U.S. as a diversion. The Japanese planned the attack in two waves. The first wave would target battleships, airfields, and hangars to cripple America's ability to respond. The second wave would focus on remaining ships and facilities. The timing was precise. The attack was scheduled for the morning of Sunday, December 7th, when American personnel would be least alert. Japan hoped that the attack would shock the United States into a quick settlement. Their goal was not to invade the U.S. mainland, but to destroy American naval power long enough to complete their conquests in Southeast Asia and then negotiate peace from a position of strength. Back in Washington, U.S. intelligence had begun to intercept Japanese diplomatic messages. Known as the magic intercepts, these communications hinted at possible hostilities. However, the exact timing and location of an attack remained unclear. American attention was focused on possible threats to the Philippines or British Malaya. American military commanders in Hawaii, Admiral Husband E. Kimmel and General Walter Short, had received vague warnings about potential Japanese aggression. However, they believed sabotage or attacks elsewhere were more likely than a direct assault on Pearl Harbor. Defensive preparations remained minimal. As the task force neared Hawaii, weather conditions were favorable. The Japanese commanders gave the final orders for attack. Pilots wrote farewell messages and prepared for what they believed would be a glorious moment in Japanese history. By dawn on December 7, 1941, the first wave of planes was ready to launch. They had achieved complete surprise. The U.S. fleet lay quiet in the harbor, unaware of the storm about to descend from the skies. At 6 Gauss a.m. on December 7, 1941, the first wave of Japanese aircraft lifted off from 6 carriers positioned about 230 miles north of Oahu. The sky was clear, the sea calm, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay anchored at Pearl Harbor, unaware of the storm approaching. The strike group consisted of 183 planes, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters, all assigned specific targets. As the planes approached, they maintained strict radio silence. At 7:02 a.m., 2 U.S. Army radar operators at Opana Point detected a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north. They reported it to a junior officer who dismissed it as a group of incoming American B-17 bombers scheduled to arrive that morning. At 7:55 a.m., the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. Japanese planes came in low and fast, launching torpedoes at battleships lined along Battleship Row. The USS Oklahoma was hit multiple times, capsized, and sank within minutes. The USS Arizona was struck by an armor-piercing bomb that ignited its forward ammunition magazine, causing a massive explosion that tore the ship apart and killed over 100 sailors instantly. Meanwhile, other planes strafed airfields at Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and Ford Island. Hangars were destroyed. Aircraft burned on the ground, and American pilots were killed before they could reach their cockpits. Anti-aircraft fire began to respond, but it was disorganized and insufficient. The second wave of 167 Japanese aircraft arrived at 8:40 a.m. They targeted cruisers, destroyers, and the naval yard infrastructure. The USS Shaw exploded in dry dock, sending a towering fireball into the sky. The USS West Virginia and USS California were badly damaged and sank in shallow water. The harbor itself became a scene of chaos: smoke, fire, oil-slicked waters, and trapped sailors fighting to survive. Despite the destruction, several American ships, including the aircraft carriers USS Lexington, USS Enterprise, and USS Saratoga, were not present during the attack. Their absence would later prove crucial in the Pacific War. Japanese forces had planned to target them, but failed due to their absence. At the same time, Japanese mini-submarines attempted to infiltrate the harbor but were largely ineffective. One was detected and destroyed before the attack began, and others were sunk or disabled without causing significant damage. By 9:45 a.m., the attack was over. The Japanese aircraft began their return to the carriers, having lost only 29 planes. In just under 2 hours, Japan had delivered one of the most devastating blows in American military history. In total, the attack killed 403 Americans and wounded over 2,100 more. 18 U.S. Navy ships were hit, including 8 battleships, 4 of which were sunk. Over 300 aircraft were damaged or destroyed. Fires raged for hours, and rescue efforts continued into the night as survivors searched for comrades trapped in overturned hulls. While Japan celebrated a stunning tactical victory, they had failed to destroy vital infrastructure such as fuel depots, repair yards, and the submarine base. Moreover, the American aircraft carriers, the real strategic threat, had survived unscathed. The attack unified American public opinion overnight. Isolationism evaporated, and anger surged across the nation. President Franklin D. Roosevelt would soon address Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy, setting the stage for America's full entry into World War II. In the immediate aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy and Army personnel scrambled to rescue survivors, assess damage, and regain some sense of order amid the devastation. Sailors worked around the clock to extinguish fires, recover bodies, and free those trapped below deck in capsized ships. Oil fires blazed across the harbor's waters well into the night, hampering rescue operations and darkening the sky with smoke. Hospitals on Oahu quickly became overwhelmed with casualties. Medical staff worked non-stop, treating burns, shrapnel wounds, and trauma injuries. Civilian volunteers rushed in to donate blood and assist however they could. Triage centers were established in hangars and open areas. Despite limited supplies, doctors and nurses performed dozens of emergency surgeries under harrowing conditions. The U.S. government's response was swift. At 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on December 7th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was informed of the full extent of the devastation. His military advisors emphasized the surprise and scale of the attack, describing it as a catastrophic loss. Roosevelt immediately authorized the mobilization of military resources and convened with his cabinet and congressional leaders. The next morning, December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. His speech was broadcast live over radio to millions of Americans. He famously declared December 7th a date which will live in infamy, and called for a formal declaration of war against the Empire of Japan. His voice was steady but grim as he outlined the events and emphasized the treachery of the unprovoked attack. Congress responded with near-unanimous approval. The Senate voted 82-0 and the House passed the resolution 388-1. The only dissenting vote came from Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist who had also opposed World War I. At 4:10 p.m. on December 8th, Roosevelt signed the declaration, and the United States was officially at war with Japan. Almost simultaneously, Japan declared war on the United States and the British Empire. On December 11th, Germany and Italy, allies of Japan under the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States. America responded in kind, now fully engaged in World War II on both the Pacific and European fronts. Back at Pearl Harbor, a formal naval inquiry began to investigate how such a surprise attack was possible. Questions arose regarding intelligence failures, miscommunication, and preparedness. The Roberts Commission was established by Roosevelt to conduct a full review. Its findings highlighted lapses in judgment by key military leaders in Hawaii, but largely cleared Washington officials of responsibility. The public reaction in the U.S. was one of unified outrage and patriotism. Thousands of young men lined up at recruitment centers across the country. War bonds were introduced, and factories shifted to wartime production within weeks. The phrase "Remember Pearl Harbor" became a national rallying cry used in posters, songs, and speeches to fuel the war effort. Meanwhile, Japan celebrated what it saw as a stunning military success. But behind the triumph, Japanese leadership underestimated America's industrial might and public resolve. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, privately feared that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant. Though the attack dealt a severe blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet, the damage would not be permanent. Efforts to salvage and repair sunken ships began almost immediately. Within months, many vessels returned to service. The carriers, untouched by the attack, would lead the American counteroffensive in the Pacific. The aftermath of Pearl Harbor was not just military. It was psychological and political. It changed the American mindset, ended isolationism, and unified a nation that would now fight on two fronts to restore peace and defeat totalitarianism. Pearl Harbor had not only brought the United States into war, it had transformed it forever. After the shock of the Pearl Harbor attack, the United States quickly moved to strike back at the Japanese Empire. The primary goal was to demonstrate that the U.S. could retaliate, even after the devastation at Pearl Harbor, and to gain a foothold in the Pacific theater. The American counteroffensive would begin with the famous Doolittle Raid. On April 18, 1942, the United States launched a daring bombing raid on Tokyo, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. The raid was a bold, though limited strike that had immense psychological value. Using B-25 bombers, which were launched from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, Doolittle's force bombed Tokyo and several other Japanese cities. Although the raid caused minimal physical damage, its symbolic significance was immense. The Japanese government had been caught off guard, and the morale of both sides was significantly impacted. Following the Doolittle raid, the Japanese Empire began to realize that their advantage in the Pacific was not as secure as they had believed. The Japanese fleet, which had been dominant in the early months of the war, began to lose confidence in its own invulnerability. This shift in momentum set the stage for the next significant battle in the Pacific, the Battle of the Coral Sea. In early May 1942, the United States, now aware of Japan's intentions in the South Pacific, moved to intercept the Japanese fleet. The Battle of the Coral Sea was the first major naval engagement between aircraft carriers. Both sides suffered significant losses, but the battle was considered a strategic victory for the United States, as it thwarted Japan's plans to invade Port Moresby in New Guinea. The battle demonstrated that naval warfare had shifted from battleship engagements to carrier-based warfare, a transformation that would dominate the Pacific War for the rest of the conflict. The Battle of the Coral Sea was followed by the more decisive Battle of Midway, which took place from June 4 to 7, 1942. Midway Island was of critical strategic importance to both the United States and Japan. The Japanese sought to seize the island to extend their defensive perimeter and eliminate the U.S. Pacific Fleet. However, the United States had broken the Japanese naval code and knew of the impending attack. This intelligence coup allowed Admiral Chester W. Nimitz to set up a trap for the Japanese fleet. The Battle of Midway was one of the turning points of the Pacific War. The U.S. Navy, using its aircraft carriers, launched a devastating counterattack against the Japanese fleet, sinking 4 of Japan's aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The loss of these carriers, which had been the backbone of Japan's naval strength, was a catastrophic blow. The U.S. also destroyed many of Japan's most experienced pilots, further weakening their ability to wage war in the Pacific. Following Midway, the Japanese Navy was no longer able to mount large-scale offensives against the U.S., and the initiative in the Pacific shifted to the Allies. The success at Midway also provided a much-needed morale boost to the United States, which had suffered a devastating blow just months earlier at Pearl Harbor. The victory allowed the U.S. to shift from a defensive posture to one of aggression, launching a series of offensives that would eventually bring them closer to Japan's home islands. From this point forward, the United States began a policy of island hopping, capturing key islands in the Pacific and using them as staging areas for further advances toward Japan. Each victory, though costly in terms of casualties, brought the U.S. closer to their goal of defeating Japan and ending the war. After the victory at the Battle of Midway, the United States began a series of aggressive offensives to reclaim territory in the Pacific. This campaign, known as island hopping, focused on capturing strategically important islands while bypassing heavily fortified Japanese strongholds. The goal was to isolate and weaken Japanese forces in these strongholds, and to use the captured islands as bases for launching further attacks. The first significant operation in the island-hopping campaign was the Battle of Guadalcanal. In August 1942, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal, an island in the Solomon Islands chain that was of great strategic importance. The Japanese had begun building an airfield on Guadalcanal, which would threaten Allied supply lines between the U.S. and Australia. The battle quickly turned into a brutal struggle for control of the island, marked by heavy fighting in the jungle, naval battles, and air combat. The U.S. forces, despite initial setbacks, were able to secure Guadalcanal by early 1943, which marked the first major Allied victory in the Pacific and gave the U.S. a much-needed foothold in the Solomon Islands. Following Guadalcanal, the U.S. military focused on the Gilbert and Marshall Islands in 1943. The Battle of Tarawa, which occurred in November 1943, was one of the most intense and costly engagements in the early phase of the island-hopping campaign. U.S. Marines faced fierce Japanese resistance while attempting to capture the heavily fortified island of Betio, part of the Tarawa Atoll. The battle, lasting just 76 hours, resulted in heavy casualties on both sides, but the U.S. ultimately prevailed. The capture of Tarawa provided the United States with a vital base for further operations in the Central Pacific. In 1944, the U.S. moved on to the Mariana Islands, specifically Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands were crucial because they were close enough to Japan to serve as bases for B-29 Superfortress bombers. The Battle of Saipan, which began in June 1944, was one of the most pivotal battles in the Pacific. U.S. forces faced fierce Japanese resistance, but after intense fighting, the island was captured. The fall of Saipan had enormous strategic consequences, as it allowed the U.S. to begin conducting strategic bombing raids on the Japanese home islands. This was a significant turning point in the war, as Japan was now vulnerable to sustained bombing attacks from the air. The capture of Saipan was followed by the Battle of Tinian, which took place in late July and early August 1944. The island was secured relatively quickly, and it became a crucial base for launching airstrikes against Japan. Meanwhile, the Battle of Guam, fought in the same time frame, was another key victory for the U.S., securing another important island in the Marianas chain. By the end of 1944, the U.S. had gained control of the entire Mariana Islands chain, which set the stage for a direct assault on Japan. The capture of these islands allowed the U.S. to launch a devastating air campaign against Japan, using B-29 bombers to attack industrial centers and military targets. These bombing raids, which included the firebombing of Tokyo and other cities, began to cripple Japan's infrastructure and war-making capacity. The island-hopping strategy not only weakened Japan's military position, but also made it increasingly difficult for Japan to defend its own territories. The U.S. continued its relentless push across the Pacific, eventually reaching the Philippines in 1944 and the islands closer to Japan's home territory. With each victory, the U.S. came closer to launching a final invasion of Japan, which would bring the war to its conclusion. As 1944 came to a close, the United States' victory in the Pacific seemed increasingly inevitable. With the fall of key islands, including Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the U.S. had gained control over vital bases that allowed for sustained air campaigns against Japan. The strategic bombing raids intensified, and Japan's industrial capacity was significantly damaged, crippling its ability to continue fighting a prolonged war. However, Japan remained resilient, and the U.S. knew that a final invasion of Japan would be necessary to end the conflict. By mid-1945, the U.S. had successfully conducted the Battle of Iwo Jima, a brutal and costly assault that gave the U.S. forces an airfield within striking distance of Japan's home islands. Iwo Jima was essential for providing a base for B-29 bombers to conduct bombing runs on Japan. The island was heavily fortified by the Japanese, and the battle was marked by fierce fighting, resulting in over 26,000 U.S. casualties and nearly all of the 21,000 Japanese defenders being killed. The famous photograph of U.S. Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi became one of the most iconic images of the war. After the victory on Iwo Jima, the U.S. moved toward the Battle of Okinawa, the last major obstacle before an invasion of the Japanese home islands. Okinawa, located just 350 miles from Japan, was critical for the U.S. to establish a staging area for the invasion. The battle, which began in April 1945, was one of the bloodiest of the war. The Japanese employed kamikaze tactics, launching suicide missions against U.S. ships and planes. The fighting on the island was ferocious, and casualties were staggering on both sides. In total, over 49,000 U.S. soldiers were killed or wounded, while Japanese losses exceeded 100,000. Okinawa's capture was a decisive moment in the Pacific War, but it also demonstrated the high human cost that would be involved in a full-scale invasion of Japan. Despite these victories, U.S. planners feared that an invasion of Japan would result in an even greater loss of life. The Japanese military was determined to defend the home islands at all costs, and the civilian population had been mobilized to fight in a last-ditch effort to repel the invaders. The U.S. government began considering alternative methods to bring the war to a swift conclusion. One such option was the use of the newly developed atomic bomb, a weapon of unprecedented destructive power that had been tested successfully in July 1945 in the desert of New Mexico under the Manhattan Project. The decision to use the atomic bomb was not taken lightly. U.S. President Harry S. Truman, who had taken office after the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt in April 1945, faced immense pressure from military leaders to end the war quickly and decisively. The bomb was seen as a means to avoid a costly invasion of Japan and to force Japan's surrender without further bloodshed. However, there was also a moral and ethical debate over the use of such a weapon, given its catastrophic potential. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, a city in western Japan. The bomb, known as Little Boy, was a uranium-based weapon that exploded with a force equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The destruction was massive, with an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people killed instantly, and many more dying from radiation, sickness, and injuries in the days and weeks that followed. Despite the devastation, Japan did not immediately surrender. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, the U.S. dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on the city of Nagasaki. This bomb, called Fat Man, was a plutonium-based weapon and was even more powerful than the first. The explosion killed an estimated 40,000 to 75,000 people instantly, and many more were left suffering from severe burns and radiation exposure. The shock and devastation caused by the atomic bombings, combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan on August 8, 1945, finally convinced Japan's leadership to surrender. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its unconditional surrender, effectively ending World War II. The surrender was officially signed on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, marking the formal conclusion of the conflict. The decision to use atomic bombs remains controversial to this day. Some argue that it was necessary to end the war quickly and save lives, while others believe that it was an unnecessary act of destruction that caused immense suffering to civilians. However, there is no doubt that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki played a crucial role in bringing about Japan's surrender and ending the war. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, had profound and lasting consequences on the United States, Japan, and the entire world. In the immediate aftermath, the United States was thrust into the war, marking a pivotal moment in the Second World War and fundamentally changing the course of history. The event not only propelled the U.S. into global conflict, but also set the stage for its emergence as a superpower in the post-war world. Pearl Harbor sparked a dramatic shift in American foreign policy, which had been largely isolationist until that point. The attack united the American public behind the war effort, with the slogan, "Remember Pearl Harbor," becoming a rallying cry. The U.S. declared war on Japan the following day, and soon after, Nazi Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, bringing the U.S. fully into the European theater as well. The United States would go on to lead the Allied powers to victory, playing a critical role in defeating both Germany and Japan. However, the consequences of the attack on Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the military actions of the war. The most significant long-term result of the war's outcome was the creation of a new global order, one in which the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two dominant superpowers. The war had decimated much of Europe and Asia, leaving a power vacuum that the U.S. and the USSR would soon compete to fill. Following the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, the world's major powers met at conferences such as the Yalta Conference and the Potsdam Conference to plan the post-war world order. The Allies' goal was to prevent the rise of another totalitarian regime and to ensure that the global balance of power would be maintained. This would lead to the establishment of the United Nations in 1945, an organization designed to foster international cooperation and prevent future wars. At the same time, the growing tension between the United States and the Soviet Union led to the start of the Cold War, a period of political and military rivalry that would dominate international relations for the next several decades. The Cold War was characterized by the ideological divide between the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. The rivalry resulted in proxy wars, arms races, and a global division of influence that would shape the world until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The attack on Pearl Harbor also played a significant role in Japan's post-war transformation. The war's devastation had left Japan in ruins, and the country was forced to surrender unconditionally. The United States, under General Douglas MacArthur, oversaw the occupation and rebuilding of Japan, which was subjected to widespread political, social, and economic reforms. Japan's militaristic government was dismantled, and the country adopted a new constitution, renouncing war as a means of settling international disputes. The post-war period also saw Japan's rapid industrialization and emergence as one of the world's leading economic powers by the 1960s and 1970s. The Pearl Harbor attack also had significant cultural and societal impacts, both in the U.S. and Japan. In the United States, it led to the internment of Japanese Americans, a dark chapter in U.S. history where over 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly relocated and incarcerated in internment camps. The internment was later recognized as a grave injustice, and reparations were made to survivors in the 1980s. In Japan, the attack and its aftermath deeply impacted national consciousness. For many years, the trauma of war and the subsequent American occupation shaped Japanese society. The war crimes trials in Tokyo and the rebuilding efforts were part of Japan's effort to reconcile with its past, and the Pearl Harbor attack remains a defining moment in Japan's history. The legacy of Pearl Harbor and the events that followed also influenced American policy and military strategy in the post-war period. The U.S. maintained a large military presence in the Pacific, especially in Japan and South Korea, to deter the spread of communism. The experience of the Pacific War also led to the development of new technologies, including the atomic bomb, which would play a role in shaping U.S. defense policies during the Cold War. Finally, the Pearl Harbor attack marked the end of an era for the United States. The nation, once hesitant to engage in European and Asian conflicts, had emerged as a dominant world power, committed to the protection of democracy and the containment of communism. The lessons learned from Pearl Harbor and the Second World War would influence U.S. foreign policy for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. If you're passionate about uncovering the forgotten stories of our past, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Don't forget to like the video if you're enjoying the journey so far, and stay tuned, because there's so much more history waiting to be unearthed right here on Buried Truths.